Hi, I'm Melanie Ann Phillips, co-creator of the Dramatica theory of story. And in this episode of Beyond Dramatica, I'm going to be exploring how Dramatica predicts the future. Well, this is pretty heady stuff. It's deep under the hood of Dramatica. And if you aren't familiar with Dramatica already, then I would suggest you might want to give this one a miss. But if you're an ongoing fan and have always wondered that tie-in between the order of acts and scenes that Dramatica is able to predict and choosing your story structure, which you do by picking the elements and what they mean, the relationship between what it means and how it unfolds, well, you're about to find out, plus a lot more. So let's get right into it. First of all, when Dramatica is predicting the future, it's doing it in what's called a closed system. What is this closed system? Well, it's the story mind. We say in Dramatica that every story has a mind of its own psychology, and its own personality. The psychology is determined by the story's structure, and the personality is developed through the storytelling. If you strip the storytelling away to look just at the structure, just at the psychology of story, it turns out that there's something called fractal psychology, in which when individuals come together in any kind of a group, they automatically self-organize that group according to their own shared psychology. And therefore the group itself becomes kind of a mega psychology, a larger psychology that operates just like each of the individuals in terms of its dynamics and its structure, its basic operating system. You see, each of us has an identical psychology when you think of it as an operating system. And it's just the experiences and information that we have gotten in our lives, the interactions and the explorations we have done, that creates our unique perspective on the world. And yet, we couldn't communicate with one another. We certainly couldn't communicate through stories unless we shared a common operating system, and that's how I'm using the term psychology in this case. A common psychology doesn't mean that we all have the same neuroses, it just means we have all the same operating system. Now, with that as a given, in real life, our operating system, our psychology, is constantly bombarded by new information, and so we're changing our outlook all the time. It's always in flux. There is no fixed point at which we can say, this is how things are. We can say, like with the uncertainty principle, this is where a mind is at the moment, and here are all the forces that are at work on it, so we can look at where it's heading in the future, but chaos interjects, which is whatever next experience we have. Even at a subatomic level, something's going to change with a stray neutrino in our minds or a cosmic ray, or we're going to run into somebody we haven't seen before and suddenly it alters our whole outlook on things. Okay, well, this kind of thing does not happen in stories. Stories are a closed system. That means that we already know as an author how it's all going to turn out, what all the pieces are, and how they relate together. Only the audience or reader does not know how things are going to happen in the end, what they're going to turn out to be, because the story is being unfolded for them over time. Now, part of that unfolding is storytelling. When you do a flashback or when you withhold information or show only a piece of what's going on and later show a larger context that changes the reader or audience interpretation of what the meaning is. But when you are creating the story, you're aware of what the scope of it is. That's why we put a time lock or an option lock into a story, because it nails the scope. It shows this is how large our argument is going to be and no larger. But within that, we have to prove our point. It shows the sides or edges of the message, the limits of what you're trying to prove. And when I talk about prove, when I talk about a story's argument, we're talking about a grand argument story. That means that when you look at any particular topic, you're going to say, in a particular situation, in a story, there are many ways to go about solving that problem. We're going to propose that one is either the best that can be used, or try to prove that it's the worst that might be tried. Whatever you do, don't do that. Well, either way, we have to show all the ways that might be tried, at least give them lip service, to show how well they do compared to the one we're trying to say is the best. Because if we just show the one we're purporting and say, this is it, well, somebody else is going to say, what about this one? What about that one? In fact, that's how story structure came to be. When an author was sitting there as a storyteller at a campfire and would relate a story, he could say, or she could say, this is the best path to take, period. Blanket statement. But People sitting around the campfire would say, yes, no, no, what about this, how about that situation? And if it was a valid point, then the storyteller could fill in all the details and say, well, in that situation that you described, it would come out this way, which is why mine is still better or worse. And similarly, if somebody else came up with something, they could say, well, in that situation, you can see that it wouldn't work as well as the one I'm purporting. And as a result, they would make the argument there in real time after making the blanket statement. But once we start recording an art form, once we start putting it into books and movies and song ballads, and we have traveling minstrels doing stories, well, if they're not the originator of the story, then they don't have any way of making that argument to their audience, and the author is removed from the audience who's ultimately going to be receiving that message. In that case, you have to include all the different ways of covering that particular issue. Try to anticipate all the reasonable ways anyone in an audience or any reader might suggest solving the same problem, so that you can show in the body of the work that those are not as good as the one you're purporting. Well, when you do that, quite by accident, over the process of communication and looking at all the ways anybody might look at an issue, in the end, you have created a map of all the ways we look at issues, and all the different ways we go about solving problems, and all the perspectives we take. And you've created, without ever thinking about it, through hundreds of years of trial and error in storytelling and communication, a model of the mind's operating system, the story mind. Now, because stories are a closed system, there's no such thing as chaos, which means that you can predict absolutely what will happen next. And why? Because a scream followed by a slap is different than a slap followed by a scream. If there's a slap followed by a scream, well, then somebody's screaming out in pain because they've been slapped, most likely. But if there's a scream followed by a slap, then it may be that somebody who's hysterical and is screaming, and the slap is trying to bring them to their senses. I learned that in film editing when I was working for about 10 years as a film and video editor professionally in the industry. And at that time, I realized that given the same exact materials to work with, that I could rearrange the order in which I put those shots in many cases and completely change the meaning, even sometimes 180 degrees, of what a scene was. And I often had to do this in order to make a scene work, because maybe the way it was intended to work, the shots just didn't cut together. By changing the order, I might even create a better meaning than was originally intended in the script or by the director. Of course, you work with the director to do that. Often I was the director, but when I wasn't, the director and I would sit down and talk about the options of what we could make this scene mean, since it wouldn't cut together the way that was intended. And we'd sometimes come up with something that was better than intended. But when you change the order of things, it changes the ultimate meaning. Conversely, if you want to arrive at a particular meaning, then it determines a certain order. If you have certain elements and you want to have it arrange this pattern at the end, and it has to go through all of these, then if you know you're going to go through part of them in a particular order, then all the rest can be determined. In fact, it is so dependent, the space and the time, how things are arranged spatially versus how they flow temporally in a closed system, that you might think of the Dramatica structure, and I don't have the chart with me today. I usually show it the little towers that you have of all the different elements and how they go into increasing detail, that it's kind of like a periodic table of story elements. Well, that's really kind of the space-time continuum of story. It shows the full extent of everything that must be explored, and how these families within families, like periodic table in a 3D chess set, it's families within families that you end up getting down to the very basic, smallest elements within the tiniest families. And all of that then shows what you're working with. When you twist it by flipping and rotating parts of that model, due to the impact you want to have, for example, if you say you want a main character who ultimately will change his point of view as opposed to remaining steadfast, that's going to cause some things to flip and other things to rotate. And similarly, if you say we want a story that has success at the end, or failure, or that you have one in which it's driven by a male-minded main character or a female-minded main character, it's going to change the direction things rotate or the way they flip. All of those have an impact. And some of the questions actually change how the flips and rotates are applied, so that if a flip would normally go here and a rotate there, answer another question, and it alters where the flip and the rotate will go and may reverse their positions. So it's a very complex model, a space-time continuum of the inside of a closed system called the story mind. But because of that, it allows us, as you'll see in the Dramatica software, that when you answer all the questions about what things mean, the Dramatica software, the story engine, will actually predict the order in which things have to happen at an act level. Now, in fact, you can go in and do it in the reverse. Answer questions in the act level for each of the 4 through lines as to the order in which things will be explored, and it will create a complete story for them and tell you what it all means. So the meaning and the order, the spatial meaning and the temporal progression are absolutely locked in, though not linearly. I hope I made that clear with all of the examples about the flips and the rotates. So with such a thing as this, you would expect that there'd be more information about the order in which things happen. And there is, because the act order that we show for the 4 through lines, we have 4 signposts spanned by 3 journeys, creating 7 items for each of the 4 through lines, which creates the 28 magic scenes, as it were. In a very simple way of structuring a story, you can take each one of those points, the story points, the signposts, and each one of the journeys for each of the 4 through lines, and give it a scene of its own plot-wise, and it creates 28 plot scenes. Now mostly you don't do that in stories because you want to have a little bit of a signpost in this scene and a little bit of a journey from some other through line in the same scene. But you could create 28 scenes and minimally cover all that you need to do to get a plot across. But you only get those 28 items, the act level appreciations, the signposts and journeys, in Dramatica as it stands. In fact, the very first story engine we built for Dramatica before we created a product that we sold, we ended up creating all of those temporal progressions, not just for the acts, but for the variations and for the elements themselves, so that you could deal with what was happening in the acts, the sequences, the scenes, and even the beats within the scenes could be absolutely predicted by knowing what the meaning of the story was to be. And you could, by using just the beats of the scenes, if you wanted, answer the order in which you wanted things to happen, and it would tell you what the entire meaning would be in the overall story, even predicting whether it would be success or failure, a male or female mental sex, or whether your character is going to change or not, for example. So, within the closed system, then, it's very easy to predict the order because it's locked absolutely in a nonlinear way to the meaning. And it works in both directions. Now, that's in stories. But Beyond Dramatica is all about psychology, physics, and other uses of Dramatica. So in part 2 of this particular section, I'm going to be picking up with an exploration of not a closed system, but an open system of real psychology in the real world, and see how Dramatica can still be predictive of real-world situations. That's it for now, and I hope you'll join me at storymind.com for more information on the Dramatica theory and the Dramatica software.